Hi, I'm Cecilia Rouse. I'm the Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, and it's really exciting to finally be officially inaugurating this center, which really does, I think, encapsulate what we think of as a first mover advantage, or what we do well at the Woodrow Wilson School, which was understanding the importance of behavioral science to public policy early on and taking the risk, as Debbie Prentice mentioned. So this is the second panel. Obviously, the center's name has got behavioral science and public policy. The first panel touched a bit on policy. We're going to hit it a little harder, at least to begin with. And so let me introduce the panel, and we'll get right to it. So at the far end, we have Cass Sunstein, who is the Robert Walmsley University professor at Harvard Law. So I got to know Cass when we were both working in the White House, and I remember vividly the day after the Affordable Care Act was passed, you came in with the entire law. He had already, in 4 hours, there were little stickies on every single regulation that he was going to need. As we were going through security, he's like, I have, how many regulations were you going to have to promulgate? Yeah, 180. Hundreds. Right. So he was instrumental in bringing insights of behavioral science directly to the White House, directly to public policy at the national level. And we next have Don Riedelmeyer, who's a professor in the Department of Medicine and the Institute of Health Policy and Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto. As we actually had a call, he kept saying, we're going to talk about policy and practice, and I completely agree with that, because practice is what we think about as policy here at the Woodrow Wilson School is putting ideas into motion. So I think that would be, so he's our resident physician, and we'll be thinking about the importance for medicine. And last, but certainly not least, is I think you are the latest faculty member to join the Woodrow Wilson School. We could not be more thrilled. Is Elka Weber, who is the Gerard R. Anglinger Professor in Energy and the Environment, Professor of Psychology and Public Affairs. We didn't think of a nickname. But she works at the intersection of psychology and environmental policy, which is just so important as we go forward. We know climate change is one of the biggest issues that we face going forward. So with no further ado, the first question, which is going to sound similar to the last panel, but we've tried to put a little bit more of a point on it, is I've asked each of them to think of, and I put compelling, example of a case where an insight from behavioral science resulted in an effective change in public policy or practice. And I've asked them to explain the importance of the insight and why it made such a difference to the policy or practice in question. So Cass drew the short straw, and we'll be going first.
Okay, a very intuitive example is there are 12.3 million children in the United States who are eating nutritious breakfasts and lunches because they are defaulted into the direct certification program. Without this program, their parents would have to opt them in. The data suggests large numbers of parents don't opt their kids in, either because they're busy, or they're frightened, or they're not sure what to do when they get a note from the government. The simple switch is they are directly certified in, they're automatically in. If they don't want to be in the program, they can opt out. If there's some error, they will be opted out. But that's 12.3 million American kids who are eating well because of a behaviorally informed policy. I'm going to add something that's super important and a little less intuitive as the kind of headline example. This is, in my view, the most important behaviorally informed policy in the United States ever, and it involves energy efficiency and fuel economy rules. So there was a reference to climate change a moment ago. There's also a problem of air pollution in the United States, which produces thousands of deaths. And there's a problem of a lack of full energy independence in the United States. And there's a problem of people spending a lot of money on their energy bills, especially people who can't really afford to spend a lot of money on their energy bills. So there's an inequality issue. In the United States, we've had 40+ energy efficiency rules, which are imposing billions of dollars in costs and having billions of dollars more in benefits. The net benefits are through the roof. They are in the dozens of billions of benefits, and this involves cars too. The behavioral point is this: if people want to buy an energy efficient refrigerator or an energy efficient clothes washer or a Prius or a Tesla, they can. So to explain why the consumer savings legitimately count in the cost-benefit analysis takes some behavioral work. Why aren't those billions of dollars in consumer savings a mirage because people aren't buying those cars? The government's explanation has two behavioral components. The first involves present bias, that human beings focus on today and tomorrow, not so much 5 and 10 years from now. So the long-term savings from an energy-efficient refrigerator aren't that big a deal when you're deciding what to put in your kitchen tomorrow. And the second point, human beings have limited attention. And the constellation of things they consider when they're buying a clothes washer and a clothes dryer might not include or might not thoroughly include the economic savings that you're going to enjoy over the life of the clothes washer or the clothes dryer. So insofar as human beings aren't calculating machines, this suite of fuel economy rules, which are having tremendous effects on American consumers, as well as air quality and climate change, and this over 40 set of energy efficiency rules, they would be very hard to explain and understand without a behavioral justification. Now, this is also a research challenge as well as a behaviorally informed policy, because actually what consumers are doing when they're buying an energy efficient or not energy efficient automobile or small motor for their boat is something on which we don't have a full understanding. So whether the behavioral story is fully true or only partially true is something which is still subject to ongoing research. But there has been a massive and quiet revolution in the United States with respect to things people are buying every day, not just cars, not just appliances, but many other things that have energy consequences. And it's impossible to understand that revolution without resort to behavioral science.
Great. Tom?
Well, that was a lot to absorb, all right? And just to be honest, I'm very frightened, not just to be sitting in front of all of you guys, but also right beside this guy. You can feel the power. But to answer the specific question, I think one insight from behavioral decision science is that people's attention spans are limited. And that by construction, we're not fully aware of all of our gaps in our attention. These are almost self-erasing errors, all right? And so that when we view any scene, there's just too much there for our brains to absorb. It's not so much that we willfully ignore the elephant in the room. It's just that there are so many other wild animals, the tigers, the bears, the lions, all right, that we fail to ask, is that all there is? Now, the best core science on this concept, I think, comes out of Daniel Simon's about attentional blindness and the demonstration of gorillas in our midst. And if you've ever been through that experiment, you'll realize that you'll never watch basketball the same way. That's a lab experiment. A demonstration in the real world has got to do about car phones and car crashes. And it fueled a whole bunch of research identifying about a 4-fold increase in risk of a serious motor vehicle crash when a driver is using a cell phone compared to when they are not using a cell phone, particularly accentuated under high-speed conditions, extending even to individuals who had years and years of experience of driving and using a cell phone. And so that then led to regulations in about 43 different countries, of which, including the United States, including New Jersey right now. All right. Now, there are 3 caveats I want to stress about with that specific example. Number one is that just because there's one piece of science doesn't mean it leads to one piece of policy. Au contraire, New York State is very tight against using a cell phone while driving, regardless of whether you're young or old or middle-aged. Whereas if you live in Arizona, it seems to only apply to school bus drivers. all right, so that with, behavioral foundations of policy, all right, there is a further diversification. Second caveat is that there's a timeline here that no one individual controls. It's not that you run your experiment on Monday, publish it on Tuesday, meet with the politician on Wednesday, and enact regulation on Thursday. Oh, you go through every one of those steps, but at somebody else's schedule. There's a lot of just sitting tight, waiting patiently for them to call, and then when they call, you have to move really, really fast. They're always impatient, as people in the White House are. Third caveat is that, at least when I speak to the New York Times or the Washington Post, I never mention the underlying behavioral decision science. All right? It's not that I'm ashamed of you, Eldar. All right? No. I talk about mundane points about, the morbidity, the mortality, the economic drain of traffic crashes, and never once the core hard science that actually informs it all. That's the secret sauce, but that stays hidden, and I don't reveal that to the world more broadly.
Why not?
Why not? Well, because the journalists really want things concrete. Secondly is that I think it's one of the few competitive advantages I've got. And I don't want to broadcast it to all those folks at Harvard, all right?
All right, so Elka, why don't you go ahead, and then I'd love to hear you.
Okay, so as the Endinger Professor of Energy and Environment, my example comes from that domain. But I think it also wins a prize for fastest transfer from theory to implementation. And that has to do with a paper that came out in 2008 by Rick Larrick and Jack Soll about the MPG illusion, arguing that the MPG, miles per gallon, is a terrible index for fuel economy. And here's an example. So what's better? For a person to update from his Chevy Suburban that gets 12 MPG to one that has 15, okay? Or for that person to trade in his other car, which is a Corolla, which gets 29 MPG, to a Prius, which gets 55. Now, if you're like in the majority of people, something like 76 out of 77 in that original study, you will say, clearly the second one is better, right? Because we're going from 29 to 55 rather than from 12 to 15. Well, wrong. And it's wrong because when the gas guzzler doesn't have to get a lot better because it uses so much gas already to improve in terms of fuel economy. Whether it's savings in terms of dollars or savings in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And so what we should be doing instead is using gallons per 100 miles traveled, for example, like they do all over Europe. Now, EPA listened, and 2 years later, from 2008 to 2010, they came out with a new label. You can't see this, but you can see it's busy, right? And so they did not replace MPG with GPM, but they added it to the label. Yeah. Now, they also didn't just listen to Rick Larrick, they listened to lots of other people, and they added 4 other metrics, which were almost completely correlated with MPG at GPM. Which has to do with the costs of running this vehicle for 5 years, 15,000 miles a year, the savings of this vehicle relative to the average vehicle, the greenhouse gas emissions index, and also a smog index. Yeah? And so we, and I should say we, which was a group at one of my previous centers for research on environmental decisions that included Rick Larrick, also Eric Johnson was in the audience, and a couple of postdocs, Ungemach and Camilleri. We looked at this label and said, is this a bad idea? Basically running a label by committee. Does it confuse people because there are too many metrics? Is it unfair because now all of a sudden we have 6 arguments for one car over the other one, and maybe fuel economy gets overweighted? Yeah? Or is it okay? And so we did a series of studies that showed, by and large, the takeaway is it's okay because it's like a menu, and people who care about money look at the money metrics. People who care about the environment look at environmental metrics. They get the information they need, and they more or less ignore the rest.
Cass, do you have anything to say about this label?
I like it.
I remember when this was being worked on.
Yeah. So what I can say is, a number of people were involved in it. It wasn't generated by EPA. It came from elsewhere. But the tale you tell about Larrick's paper, it was completely defining of the enterprise of revising it. And the desire to revise it was founded on that and developed into the idea that the gallons per mile metric was also kind of confusing. It's better. It doesn't fall into the MPG illusion, but it's confusing. So if you tell people how much does it cost to have this car per year to operate it, then you're telling them something that's intelligible and they can just add it on to the value of the car. And if you give them how much more this fuel inefficient car is going to cost than others over 5 years, then you're giving them really something they can grab hold of. So it was completely informed by the data, and the LARIC thing was foundational.
Anybody have that?
Oh no, just sort of like, you know, the simple calculations of doing reciprocal arithmetic seem really straightforward, and yet people are awfully sensitive to that, right? And so that when you do the math, it turns out to be extraordinarily important. And then, you know, to sort of phrase it correctly, it's also at the root for a lot of, you know, underestimations of risk when you use the wrong metric as well. Sort of a case in point, I would argue, is sort of this this fallacy of death and driving distance. How many policymakers focus a lot on, like, you know, the number of deaths per million miles, which seems to be awfully misleading in all sorts of ways.
Maybe just to build on Cass's point, and also to the question that was raised earlier about, you know, sort of how do we engage people more with climate change. Maybe we don't have to necessarily engage them with climate change per se, but to engage them with the consequences of climate change, and different consequences for different groups. You know, people sometimes talk about co-benefits, and so some people actually will care about financial implications, some people will care about job creation, some people will care about environmental consequences, some people care about public health, and I think for different groups, we just have to translate these statistical and abstract climate change implications into something that is concrete and people do care about and gets people's attention.
That's a very good point. Okay, so I'm going to turn to our second question, which is going to possibly move a little more theoretical. So if you hadn't noticed, this panel is kind of stocked full of rock stars. So they're eminent researchers. Okay. You didn't wear your suit, it is true. I almost brought sunglasses for everybody. So they are at the forefront of their fields. They are thinking hard about behavioral science. So I'm going to ask each of you, and Elka, I'm going to actually start with you this time, sure. To tell us about an idea or insight about which you're currently working or about which you're particularly excited about that has policy or practical relevance. Has the idea or insight already been tried in the real world? If so, tell us about it. If not, do you have ideas on where or how it should be tried or applied?
So I'm going to tell you about something called query theory. And again, this was developed over the last 15 years or so jointly by Eric Johnson and by myself at Columbia University. And it's a theory about how we make decisions as implicitly and automatically as a process of arguing with ourselves. So somebody says to you, do you want to have your standard brown electricity at a given price, or do you want to switch to green electricity at a slightly more expensive rate? Which one do you pick? You know, or if you ask when you're turning 60, do you want to start claiming Social Security right away at age 62? Or do you want to wait another sort of 1 to 8 years and get a lot more on a monthly basis? How do people make these decisions? Now, prospect theory, which of course Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky devised, tells us at a functional level, so why many of these anomalies in people's decisions, saying one answer under one frame, a different answer under a different frame come about, but doesn't really talk about the underlying psychological processes, including attention. And it's query theory does. In fact, it marries attention to decision making. And here's the nutshell version. When you think about option A or option B, you sequentially think about what's good about this, what argues for this, what argues for the other one. Sequentially, because we're finite information processors. As you think about the first one, what's good about option A, you temporarily inhibit all arguments for the other one, because you first want to find out, okay, what's good about that one? I'll get to the other one in a second. But because you temporarily inhibited them, as you now turn to B, they have a harder time coming to the surface. Yes, so we have a ton of evidence that all other things being equal, the million-dollar question is which option gets considered first? Of course, we have advertising for that, right? Advertising is saying, over here, look at my option first, right? But there are also many other important answers to that question, and one of them is defaults. You know, when somebody is a default, either because it's a behavioral default, it has been done for a while, or because somebody recommended you should be an organ donor or you should not be an organ donor, it makes sense to think about that option first. And so in the case of the electricity example, right now the default is the brown electricity. If you don't do anything, you're going to continue paying that tariff. Why not switch to green electricity as being the default option? And Cass knows there have been many field studies, randomized control trials, that shows the advantage of that. That's partly mediated by a query theory. And there's huge consensus across the political spectrum that these certain kind of defaults actually are desirable. People want them. So it's a no-brainer in a way. Let me talk about then the Social Security example where there is no default in place, and sometimes putting one in place is politically not so feasible. Is there any other way of inhibiting or interfering with this automatic process where people look at a certain option first? And as you can sort of imagine, most people, unlike most of us, actually don't like their jobs. When they have an option of retiring at 62, they might first think, what's good about retiring right away? Can we somehow inhibit this process of having them think about that option first? Now, in the lab, we sometimes tell people explicitly, first think about what's good about waiting longer and getting more money, and when they do, and then think about the other one. And when they do that, the advantage of what option they automatically consider first goes away. But that's not a very practical way of sort of doing this in the real world. And so something that Eric Johnson actually has started to do with some other colleagues is to give people checklists. This is actually in the context now of Social Security. People, as they log onto a website and they have to make this decision, this is still at the experimental stage, so it's not done for real, but just in the lab. But they see a series of arguments, either for waiting longer or for claiming right away, but they're being shown to them in opposite orders. It turns out when people see the arguments for waiting longer first, and what they do is they just say, does this argument apply to you, yes or no? And these are arguments actually generated by people who have to make these decisions. When they think about those arguments first, they actually claim between 8 and 9 months later. Now, again, at this point, it's hypothetical, but it's a huge effect that's not rivaled by anything else in that space.
Interesting. Tom?
Me? Okay, well, I've not been making any of the arguments first this afternoon. And I'll continue that.
You have another round.
Okay, so that the next basic insight from behavioral science that's been on my mind is that our minds live inside biological boxes, whether we realize that or not. And biology always fluctuates in performance, something we call homeostasis, all right? So that I'm not always the same. Sometimes my levels of all sorts of things vary over time. My level of boredom, my level of anxiety, my degree of hunger, my degree of sleepiness. As Stuart Smalley would have said, only the mediocre are always at their best. Now, with that general concept, I've also been intrigued by one of the greatest physiological changes in the world, and that is becoming pregnant. All right, astonishing changes in blood volume and lung mechanics and gastric motility. And the issue is that it just doesn't stop there. And does it actually make a difference in terms of roadway safety? Roadway safety being a sort of one of the strong themes of me, simply because it's such an opportunity for policy, simply because bad driving imposes risks on other people. So anyway, so we do this enormous study of almost a million individuals and find about a 42% increase in motor vehicle crashes during the middle months of pregnancy compared to the very same months for the very same woman the year before becoming pregnant. So a 42% increase in risk, regardless of whether it's your first child or your fourth child, regardless of whether you are richer or poorer, although the baseline risks will certainly differ in that case, regardless of whether you are having twins. Probably a combination of fatigue, stress, insomnia, back pain, neck pain, and all sorts of other unmeasurables we don't know anything about, we don't understand fully. Now, what does this mean? One policy implication at the edge is to suggest, road safety as a routine part of prenatal care for prevention. All right, so classically, in the middle months, you would see a woman and you check the blood pressure and urine and the baby's growth, and usually they're just fine. And usually there is nothing more important to do. So that's the time to add a small mention of the importance of roadway safety. Just because the risks aren't unique to pregnancy does not mean that they're not important with pregnancy. All right, so and pregnant women are extraordinarily motivated. They'll stop smoking. They will give up alcohol. And yes, they will stop at stop signs. They will buckle up. They will yield right away. They will signal through if they just get a gentle reminder about that, all right, ideally from their obstetrician. 3 caveats about this line of research. First is that, you know, in no way would we want to recommend women to delegate driving to others, because young men of this demographic group have even greater risk behind the wheel, so that would be a step backwards. Number 2 is that in no way do we think that women are necessarily at fault for the collisions. It may be that they just have delayed reaction times and it impairs their ability to avoid a crash that's being set up by somebody else. And third thing is that this potential policy application is also germane to every man out there, because we all share the road together, and none of us really wants to be involved in a crash that involves a pregnant woman. So that's something in terms of the behavioral insights.
I have to admit, I was thinking that we should be providing drivers for all women in their second trimester. Now I'm going to make that professional drivers. I'm not going to worry about the cost.
Way too radical, way too expensive. You don't need to change your driving, you just need to change your attitude slightly.
Just slightly. Cass?
Okay, I'll tell you about something I'm right now involved in. Some of the data is being collected today. Okay, here's the background. Rank in your minds, if you would, yourselves in terms of how good looking you are on a scale of 0 to 10. Now imagine you've learned from someone outside that they actually think you're a lot better looking than you said. The average person will update and be responsive to that bit of new information. Now imagine that you learn that there's someone out there who actually thinks you're less wonderful looking than you ranked yourself. The data suggests you're not going to be very responsive to that information. So we see a pervasive incorporation of good news and neglect or disregard or dismissal of bad news. This can be true for health risks, for financial prospects, a good news, bad news effect. Okay, here's what I've been obsessed by for about 2.5 years. In the domain of law and politics, does the same thing happen? And what are its precise dynamics? This applies to the Brexit and current presidential election issue also. How do people incorporate new information that jars them? Okay, the data I have in so far, it's a large data set and there's significant results. So even though the stuff is being collected, I can tell you now what we've got. It involves climate change, but I hope you'll be able to see the generality of the finding. Okay, the first thing is to sort Americans into 3 groups: high climate change believers, moderates, and low climate change believers. And these are just statistical groups, three sets, not being deniers or hysterics, just where are they in America? And then asking them, having found out what they think about climate change generally, what they expect the degree of warming by 2100 to be. Okay, this elicits the low believers are about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, the high believers about 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit, and the middle group about 5.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Those are what the numbers look like. Then what we did was to randomize and give all 3 groups, half of them, new information suggesting that people think that some scientists have concluded the climate change problem is actually much smaller than anticipated, and it's likely to be basically between 1 and 5 degrees C, where they formerly thought it was higher. And the question is, how do our 3 groups react to that information? That's like, you're better looking than you thought. That's really good news. The other half of the group was given information suggesting that new science have new information suggesting things are much worse than they thought, and we're going to get 7 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit warming by 2100. That's bad news. That's like your health prospects are much worse. Okay, the moderates, you will be, I hope, unsurprised and somewhat comforted to find, show no statistically significant difference in their reaction to the good news and the bad news. They are perfectly rational responders to new information. They go basically up 1.5 degrees F when they get the bad news. They go down 1.5 degrees F when they get the good news. The low climate change believers, here's what they look like. And I think this is not of keen intellectual interest, but it's immense practical interest. The low believers, basically when they get the good news, they go down 1 degree Fahrenheit, a full degree. So that where they were at 3.5, once they see scientists think it's going to be 1 to 5, they end up at 2.5. They show a very substantial response to the good news. Guess what their reaction to the bad news is? 0. A very large number of Americans who are not climate change deniers, they believe it's going to be 3.5 C. Once they see the 7 to 11 degree spread, they say, talk to the hand. They show no updating at all. They're like people who respond to evidence of, let's say, a health risk by saying, yeah, right. Okay, that's practically important, and I think it bears on a very wide range of issues, including race discrimination, immigration, Brexit, terrorism. Okay, here is, to me, the more interesting finding, though it's the more intellectually interesting finding. When the high climate change believers get bad news, 7 to 11, they shoot up by 2 degrees Fahrenheit. So where they were at 6.3 roughly, they're at 8.3 once they get the bad news. They're very responsive to the bad news. To the good news, they're only modestly responsive. They do go down, but less than half as much as they go up once they get the bad news. They go down 0.9 degrees Fahrenheit, modest. Okay, that's, I think, intriguing. It suggests that the people who are most alarmed, the top trilogy of the people, the top third, they are going to respond to good news, but not a whole lot. Bad news they are going to respond to, you know, like they have a nervous system that's completely reacting. Okay, what's going on there? We don't know yet what's going on there, but here's what I think, and the data is consistent with what I think. We probably will have in a few days confirmation or refutation. What I think is that for a certain class of people, what is good news for humanity is actually very bad news personally. Their system one, so to speak, in Kahneman talk, doesn't like the good news and treats it as, you're not as good looking as you think. They would rather believe the world's going on fire than that they were wrong. Now, in this case, it's one where my own politics are aligned with the group that I'm kind of not casting the happiest light on. But you can think of a wide range of cases in which it's going to completely flip politically, where people who are in the low climate change believers are affectively invested in thinking everything's going to get awful. And once they see credible information suggesting that's not so, it will be bad news. Okay. There is a little bit of comfort in this general picture, which is that the vast majority of people did react to information. And at least that is good news.
Okay, putting out that low bar there.
Can I suggest an alternative explanation? The people who, first of all, we no longer talk about believing in climate change. Climate change is a scientific fact. But aside from that, just a sidebar, the people who have a stronger belief in climate change might actually not believe your piece of evidence that you're putting out there.
Yes. So that's why I said this is my account, which is its motivated reasoning. The alternative account is that it's Bayesian, it's perfectly rational. Like if you believe that the Holocaust happened and then you're given information suggesting it really happened, you might believe the same thing or more strongly. If you say no, it was all made up, you just don't pay any attention to that. So that is possible. We will find out.
But what I want to emphasize or agree with is that there's a lot of motivated cognition out there in all domains. And sort of related to your example, we were actually, when I say we, this is together with a colleague from Bocconi, Valentina Bossetti, we were in Paris actually, and we interviewed 217 of the negotiators about what their expectations were about global temperature increases in 2100 as a result of the INDCs that were agreed upon in that setting. Obviously their estimates had a range of values, but there was evidence for regional differences. So those countries who were more vulnerable actually estimated higher temperatures, and those countries who actually sort of had a stake in carbon production down the road estimated lower values.
That's so interesting.
Like in my business, and I look after patients about a third of my time, it's certainly the case that denial is not just a river in Egypt, right? And I mean, you give patients all sorts of rattling news, and they cannot process it in one swoop. It just takes a while for it to marinate in, and so emergency decision making is often not best left to the hands of the patient or family directly involved. All right. Often easy to slide into paternalism that way. But it's also that in my business of individuals, not climate change, a patient has a right to the truth, but also has a right not to be hit over the head with the truth. There are many people who actually prefer not to know, and that has to be respected as well.
I would like to open the mics. There are 2 microphones as before. Again, it is our policy here at the school to privilege students first, but obviously others, if you have questions. We only have limited time, but I welcome questions. Or we can keep talking amongst ourselves. Hang on, why don't we let it, and then.
Since I'm not seeing any students come up. I'm a social psychologist by training. I worked with the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team in their inaugural year. Hi, Cass. And right now I work at Climate Central here across the street. Comment on what you said and then an open question. So I think my interpretation of your finding would be that knowledge or opinion towards climate change is fully steeped in our ideological landscape currently, right? So when people hear a lower estimate of what the temperature is going to be, they may well be assuming that that's motivated, and that may not necessarily be true, or that it's simply a reflection of somebody else's agenda. So I think that it would be impossible for me to understand that reaction outside of the ideological context that people are in and identity. And I think the broader question for me that came from working in the government is, how do we understand behavior in a context of the organization within which it's happening, both at the political level and at the sort of organizational structural level? So how do we think about bringing our research in a way that resonates with and actually responds to the needs and the constraints of organizations and maybe even political systems? So I'd love to hear your comments on that. Thank you.
Okay, I think your general point is right. With respect to energy, I have an answer that is based on some other research. That is, if you ask people, do you want green energy or not, you will get very significant numbers of people who will go green, even though they wouldn't opt into green if it was in an opt-in situation. So asking them the question can activate behavior. Now, that's generalizable. So the White House team, in its very recent report, maybe you were involved in it, had as one of its highlight items that when members of the armed service arrive at the military base, they are asked to make an active choice whether they want to be in a savings plan. And I think it's related to query theory, actually, because it puts it in their head. That's the question they're asking that moment, when that wouldn't be the question they'd ask. They could divert the topic, they're allowed to do that, but the very question resulted in a quite significant increase in usage. So a policy upshot for behavioral work for the area you are describing, that is environments, is often asking people to make an active choice. Has a much larger impact than anticipated. In fact, in my own work, it involves a survey whose results I don't really believe, but the result is that active choosing produces more green energy use than defaulting people into green energy.
Okay.
Actually, just to add to that, I think I believe that result, in part because when you default people into something, there's always a certain proportion who have reactance against being told what to do. Right. And oftentimes actually choose against their preferences just to assert that autonomy. But there are situations where sort of active choice is stressful, and so organ donation is one example. Who wants to think about what it's like after you die and you're going to get cut into pieces, and all this sort of implement.
Okay, what you just said is very important, and it's comforting to me as the author of a study that I don't fully believe, and it does have, it has, because I believe it more, I'm updating, you've given me good news, and this is something people here can work on. So. The basic idea, and this is consistent with our data, because we did a guilt manipulation. We asked people, how guilty do you feel? In the active choosing version, they felt very guilty not going green, even if they didn't go green. In the default rule, they felt less guilty. And I think that's because they were mad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, like in my business, active choice really does facilitate long-term management, particularly if something goes wrong. Clearly, if the patient selects their operation for themselves by free choice, if there is a postoperative complication, they're just going to be much tougher about it, a little bit more resilient, and a little bit more cooperative with all sorts of other setbacks there.
Interesting.
Yeah, self-determinism works well.
Did you want to ask your question?
Not even a question, but just a very brief comment, because one thing that occurred to me in terms of your experiment, Professor Sestein, on the, let's call it response bias, one explanatory factor might be the individual's emotional engagement to change. So effectively, when you looked at people like at Brexit, they were going to get out and vote no matter what, because they felt very, very strongly that they wanted out. When you look at perhaps the US elections, I would argue that the only thing Hillary Clinton has to worry about is that people assume, once again, pluralistic ignorance, she's going to win because she's so far ahead, whereas the Trump voters will go out regardless and vote. And I was thinking perhaps in your case, it's a question whereby those who are trying to affect change, i.e. in this case, stop the climate from deteriorating, feel more strong and therefore will have a stronger response to something that goes in their favor than the ones who basically might just be in denial about this potential change, so things will just continue on as usual.
It's possible, but that's not mandated with the data, and I'd have to go back to look at it. I think it's in some, it doesn't fit easily with the data. So the people who are very worried about climate change, they are, consistent with what you said, very responsive to new information. It's even more horrible than they think. But the people who are unworried, they are quite responsive to the news that they needn't worry even as much as they are. So we're probably seeing roughly the same order of shooting down among the non-worriers, who are not the deniers, as we're seeing shooting up among the worriers. So it's looking on, if we do the statistical test, I think it's looking pretty close.
But the level of conviction, the non-worriers and the worriers might have the same level of conviction, so they might skew each other in the same.
Well, okay, so we didn't do an independent measure of level of conviction, so that would be interesting to test, but they're not skewing each other. It's that the people who are they think the U.S. should sign the Paris Agreement. They consider themselves environmentalists. They are highly responsive to bad news and only modestly responsive, but responsive to good news. The people who think Paris Agreement they're not so sure about, who think we're only going to get 3.5 degrees warming, they are acting individually, highly responsive to good news and zero responsive to bad news. So it's the asymmetry that parallel each other. Maybe to say a little bit more about practical/policy relevance, our experiment is one in which people are getting little bits of information, one of which says it's okay, the other which says it's horrific. That's kind of the world if you multiply it times a zillion. We are constantly being bombarded with good news and bad news. And the question is what we find credible. And the data suggests that over a certain, life is an iterated version of our experiment. And the result is that you're going to get polarization of exactly the kind we find, where the scared people get more and more scared, and the unscared people get less and less scared, because that's the information they credit.
My name is Kian Min-Soo. I'm a visiting doctoral student. And this is aimed at Cass Sunstein, but I think Elka Weber might be interested in addressing it as well. It's about social cost of carbon. So in 2014, you wrote a paper in AER where you said we shouldn't revisit discount rates in terms of the social cost of carbon. For institutional reasons, it's very difficult to go through this bureaucratic process. So obviously, there's worries that we'll get out of date in terms of how the economic theory feeds into these. So I'm wondering what you think the role of sort of expertise in this decision-making process is. If we don't revisit these, how do they get updated, and how do our methodologies for getting to social cost of carbon improve?
So I think that my title, which was mine, of the paper may have wrong-footed some readers. The title is called On Not Revisiting the Social Cost of Carbon. And the argument isn't that we shouldn't revisit the social cost of carbon. I'm all for doing that. By the way, the social cost of carbon is a very important ingredient in government decisions about how stringent to be with respect to greenhouse gas relevant initiatives. So it's foundational. To revisit it is a good idea. It's just that you shouldn't revisit it merely because you're more likely to get an accurate result. You also should consider the decision costs of trying to get there. And if you got just epsilon better and you drive everyone crazy, the country, Congress, the executive branch, epsilon's too little to be worth it. So the plea is for considering decision costs and error costs. If new science comes in, then it's different. The presumption should be in favor of revisiting the social cost of carbon.
Can I quickly follow up then? So Robert Pindyck has been doing this expert elicitation stuff where his social costs of carbon are quite a bit higher than, of course, the ones that are operating out of the committee. So I assume that that's the sort of thing you would endorse, looking at that,
well,
if those values are
so. This isn't so behavioral, but I'm not that excited about expert elicitations in this context. I'm very excited about Pindyck. I think he's superb. But the idea of just asking a whole bunch of people what they think the social cost of carbon is, that's better than despair, but it's kind of like despair. And what the US government has done instead is to rely on 3 integrated assessment models and basically to give them equal weight. And the integrated assessment models, Pindyck has some, reasonable objections to, but they have a lot of stuff in them that's contentful, and just asking, a bunch of people, even if they're experts, what do you think the social cost of carbon is? They're probably not going to know. You'd have to be very excited about the wisdom of crowds, and at least for these purposes, not that interested in Kahneman and Tversky, if you're with me. You have to think there's no distortion in expert judgments in this context to think that the expert elicitation method is reliable. Now, Pindyck's a formidable person, and to disagree with him, is hazardous, but I do.
So reading, I don't know how much you read between the lines on what Cass was saying. What he didn't say explicitly, but I will, was that politically and to organize and get everybody behind, because if OIRA or if in these regulations you're going to use a number, Cass couldn't just single-handedly say, this is what I declare the social cost of carbon to be. He had to work with many agencies and many people who saw who had these very different perspectives, and they had to negotiate that. It was not a trivial exercise. It was a very important exercise, and I think what Cass is saying is that if you're just going to get a marginal gain with a marginal, to go through that entire exercise again is just not worth it. That's the other side of policy, which I'll confess, I don't know that we do as well here at the Woodrow Wilson School. We try bringing in practitioners, et cetera, which is that there is theory and there is implementation. And implementation is, if it doesn't get implemented, you haven't done it. And it's a whole nother ballgame. Any other questions? I know Cass has got a hard stop in just a couple of minutes, but I know, one last question.
Hi, my name is Kara, and I'm a second-year MPA here. Prior to coming to Princeton, I worked in energy policy in California, specifically energy efficiency. And in California, they allow the utilities to design behavioral programs, and they will actually get savings counted for them. So it's a great opportunity. But a lot of the utilities, they're running into the program of maintaining the persistence of their interventions, in the sense that they don't have the resources to keep on checking in on, for example, a workplace that they designed a competition, and it lasted a month where people were trying to lower their energy use, and then the program moves on to another workplace, and then what happens there. So I was just wondering your insights on kind of how to maintain those interventions once you leave, and to ensure that level of persistence.
Okay, so a default rule should be persistent. So if people are defaulted into double-sided printing, or to saving for retirement, or to automatic full payment of their credit card bills, that tends to be robust. So defaulting people into greener energy, you may see some attrition, but it should work pretty well over time. With respect to social norm interventions, the evidence is if you send people a little note saying that they're using more energy than their peers, which can have the same effect in cutting energy use as an 8 to 20% spike in the short-term cost of electricity. So that's significant. If you send it once or twice, it's not going to have a long-term impact. But if you send it, the data suggests, over 2 years, then it's going to stick, because people will build up the capital.
Don, did you?
Yeah, but just sort of an add-on to that. In terms of sustaining behavior change, I think it makes a big difference if it's a one-and-done decision, like which program to enroll in, versus an activity you have to return to day after day after to, exercising regularly, losing weight, taking your medications as prescribed. I think the nudges and other factors are great for starting the ball, for initiating the behavior, but for sustaining it in the long run, there's nothing that works as well as changing a person's identity. All right? They really have to take it internally, i.e., when you're first called a mother, that changes your behavior in a very sustained manner. When you're first diagnosed with cancer or some other disease, you take that quite to heart. That changes your own internal identity, and that will have make a sustained difference for better or for worse in the way you behave thereafter.
Okay, did you?
Just to build on that, I think one thing that's nice about social identities, it has a snowballing effect. Each time you make a decision because you are a member of this group that you appreciate, it reinforces your identity, so it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's why sort of over time, you sustain the behavior. But more generally, I mean, we should think about other ways in which we can build better habits, and think about these more intermediate, sometimes even financial incentives as stepping stones, as crutches towards building habits where people automatically do the kind of behavior that we want them to engage in, whether it's by social identity or by other means.
Well, I hope you'll join me in thanking this fabulous rock star.